Tonight, we walk past the barn doors, the wooden fences, the neatly kept ledger. It feels like any old farm, until you notice the stock being counted weren't animals. In the 18th and 19th centuries, some farms in America weren't growing crops, they were producing people. And the real story isn't just in the numbers inked on the page, but in the cold, calculated system that turned human life into a business plan. If this history story helps you relax and drift into sleep after a long, tiring day, give it a like and hit subscribe. Drop a comment, where in the world are you listening from, and how late have you stayed up for this? Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's slip quietly back through the centuries together. See it in your mind. A quiet morning somewhere in the American South 2 centuries ago. The sun's just climbing over the horizon, spilling that golden Instagram filter kind of light across rolling fields. A wooden fence creaks in the wind. You hear the distant clink of a metal latch, the shuffle of boots on dirt, maybe a few voices calling out in the distance. On the surface, it's just another rural scene. It's the kind you'd expect to see in a farming calendar, maybe with some cows chewing grass in the background. But there's no cattle here, no sheep, no pigs. This isn't that kind of farm. Instead, inside one of those weathered barns, there's a desk, on it a ledger, inkwell, and neat columns of names, dates, and notes. At a glance, it looks like an inventory list for livestock. But read a little closer and you realize these aren't animals. They're people. Each line isn't a breed of cow or weight of hog. It's a human being with measurements, health notes, and cryptic comments like strong worker or good breeder. It's the kind of realization that makes your stomach drop. Just in case you thought I was exaggerating, this was an actual thing. Plantation owners kept records the way modern companies track productivity spreadsheets, except the employees didn't get a salary, benefits, or a nice break room with a coffee machine. The entire setup was designed to manage what they chillingly referred to as stock, except this stock could walk, talk, and dream. And those dreams didn't matter one bit. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds horrific. But surely this was some fringe, isolated thing. Oh, if only. No, this was organized. Systematic, the same way you might imagine a modern corporation holding quarterly meetings, setting yearly targets, and updating their KPIs. Except here, the KPIs were measured in births, not profits. Imagine a boss walking into the office and saying, "All right, team, this quarter's target is up 10%. Let's make it happen. Now replace team with enslaved population and target with children born into servitude." That's the cold, transactional reality we're talking about. And here's the kicker. To the people running these places, this wasn't even seen as unusual. This was just business. That's what makes this opening scene so unnerving. It's quiet. It's orderly. It looks nothing like the chaos of battlefields or the brutality you might picture when you hear the word slavery. But don't let the calm fool you. This was violence of a different kind. It was violence disguised as management, cruelty hidden under the tidy columns of a ledger book. And there's another detail that makes this scene all the more chilling: the language. By calling people stock or breeders, it stripped away everything that made them human. Words are powerful like that. If you can rename someone into a statistic, you can stop feeling bad about what you're doing to them. You can look at that ledger and see not a woman with a family, but breeding female number 4. Not a man with dreams of freedom, but strong male, age 22. It's an accounting trick for the conscience. We'd like to think we've moved on as a society, but honestly, the same mental gymnastics happen today, just in different industries. In some modern offices, workers get reduced to resources or headcount and reports. In certain warehouse jobs, human beings are tracked by their scanning speed like they're part of the machinery. The difference, of course, is that now we can quit those jobs. Back then, quitting wasn't an option. The system made sure of it. So when we talk about slave breeding, this is the starting point. A farm that's not about crops or livestock, but about generating human beings as property. It's an image that seems absurd until you remember that every line in that ledger represented a life. Those lives were treated as investments. And here's where the story deepens. Because this wasn't just some twisted side project on a couple of plantations. This was tied into the larger machinery of the Southern economy, a response to changing laws, and a reflection of how far people will go to protect their wealth. But to understand why these ledgers existed at all, we need to step outside this barn, Look at those wide fields and zoom out until we see the entire economic engine that made this possible. And that's where we're headed next. You've probably heard the phrase, "America was built on hard work." Sounds nice, right? It's inspiring. It's the kind of thing you'd put on a motivational poster next to a picture of a sunrise. But here's the fine print they leave out. The hard work was often done by people who didn't get paid, didn't get to leave, and didn't exactly sign up for the job. In the 18th and 19th centuries, America's economy was like a giant machine running on three things: cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Think of them as the big three energy drinks of the time, the products everyone wanted and couldn't get enough of. They were fueling fashion, sweetening tea, and lining the pockets of anyone lucky enough to own the land that grew them. But the real engines weren't the shiny new steam machines or the riverboats. They were human beings. Enslaved human beings. Now, when the transatlantic slave trade was in full swing, plantation owners could simply buy more workers whenever they needed them, like restocking inventory at a store. But then came laws and international pressure to restrict the importation of enslaved Africans. Suddenly, the supply chain got complicated. Imagine if today you ran a business that relied on importing iPhones from overseas, and overnight, that supply stopped. You wouldn't just shrug and say, "Oh well, guess we're closing up shop." You'd look for another way to get them, maybe even start building them yourself. That's exactly what happened here. Plantation owners didn't see people. They saw human resources in the most literal, chilling way. If they couldn't buy enough workers, they decided to make them. Not in a factory, not with machines, but through birth. It was an economy built on biology. And the logic was as cold as a spreadsheet. A child born to an enslaved woman would, by law, belong to the enslaver. That meant every new baby wasn't just a baby. It was future labor, future profit, future capital. To understand how important this was, you have to picture the sheer scale of these crops. Cotton wasn't just a southern thing, it was global. British textile mills were hungry for it. The Industrial Revolution practically had cotton fibers running through its veins. Tobacco was in everyone's pipes, and sugar was transforming diets around the world. If you were in the business of producing any of these, you were in high demand. But high demand also meant you needed a workforce that didn't quit, didn't strike, and ideally reproduced itself. That's where the self-sufficiency model came in. Slavers didn't just want workers, they wanted a renewable workforce. It's grim to say, but from their point of view, every child born into slavery was like planting a tree you'd never have to water, because the watering was forced and constant. Over time, this system meant that even if no more ships ever arrived from Africa, the population of enslaved people in America could still grow, and it did. By the mid-1800s, millions of people were enslaved in the United States. And a significant portion of that number had been born there, into a life they never chose. And let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't some hidden, shadowy practice that no one knew about. It was openly discussed in newspapers, in letters, even in advertisements. Enslavers compared notes, swapped strategies, and treated human reproduction like crop rotation. They knew that a pregnant woman might not be able to work in the fields at full capacity for months, but to them, that was just the cost of doing business. The return on investment came when that child grew old enough to pick cotton, cut tobacco, or boil sugarcane. If this all sounds inhuman, that's because it was. But here's the thing. To the people running these plantations, it felt normal. It fit neatly into the same economic logic they used for livestock, crops, and property. And when something feels normal to enough people for long enough, it starts to become invisible. That's the danger of systems like this. They don't just exploit, they normalize the exploitation until it doesn't even look like exploitation anymore. And it wasn't just about economics. The breeding system also created a society where slavery was literally woven into the family tree. Generations could be born, live, and die on the same land, all under the control of the same family of enslavers. That's not just forced labor, that's generational captivity. If you zoom out, it's a bit like looking at one of those giant slow-moving machines in an old factory. Can't see the gears turning at first, but if you watch long enough, you realize the whole thing is powered by human lives. Lives fed into it, one after another, with no escape. Of course, if you were an enslaved person, you saw the system for exactly what it was. You didn't call it self-sufficiency or economic necessity. You called it what it felt like. A cage, no matter how well oiled the machine seemed from the outside. On the inside, there was always tension, resistance, and the constant question of whether escape was possible. The economy that fed on human bodies wasn't some accidental byproduct of history. It was deliberate, calculated, and sustained for generations. And while the world outside debated morality, trade laws, and politics, inside those fields and barns, the reality was simple. Every cotton boll, every cured tobacco leaf, every grain of sugar had a human cost. One that can't be measured in dollars, pounds, or barrels. Because when your entire economy is built on the backs and wombs of people, you're not just running a business, you're running a human factory. And sooner or later, that leaves a mark too deep for history to ever fully erase. If the last part was about the money machine that ran on human bodies, this is where the law steps in and essentially says, yep, that's fine, carry on. Enter the legal doctrine with the catchy Latin name, partus sequitur, ventrum. It sounds fancy enough to be a Harry Potter spell, but instead of summoning a feather, cemented one of the cruelest loopholes in American history. Here's the translation. The child follows the condition of the mother. In plain English, if a woman was enslaved, so were her children forever. It didn't matter who the father was, whether he was free, rich, poor, white, or the King of England himself. If the mother was property, the child was property. Full stop. You can probably see the ugly math that followed. Every child born under this law was an automatic addition to the owner's workforce without buying anyone new. No ships from Africa, no smugglers to bribe, just the self-replenishing labor supply. You could grow in your own backyard. Plantation owners didn't need a crystal ball to see what that meant for their profit margins. Imagine this rule in a modern workplace. Any child born to an employee automatically becomes an unpaid intern for life. People would quit, lawsuits would explode, chaos everywhere. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, this wasn't just enforced, it was celebrated by those in power. It was their insurance plan against a shrinking labor market. And it didn't even start in America. The idea was borrowed from English colonial law in the 1660s, specifically from Virginia. Back then, the colonies needed a way to lock in their workforce without endless debates about whether children could be owned. The solution? Treat humans like livestock. Ownership passes down through birth. It wasn't a metaphor. It was the literal legal reasoning. The ripple effects were enormous. Women who were enslaved became not only laborers but also involuntary producers in the eyes of their owners. Their ability to have children wasn't seen as a personal human experience. It was an asset on a balance sheet. And this wasn't hidden in secret documents. It was openly recorded in plantation ledgers, advertisements, and even court cases. One 1829 Virginia case tells the story plainly. An enslaved woman was promised freedom by her owner. But when the owner died, his heirs argued she couldn't be freed because she had children, and those children were part of the estate's assets. The court agreed instantly. No hesitation, no moral debate, just business as usual. It's easy to see why this doctrine became the engine behind the breeding system. Without it, children of enslaved women might have lived in legal limbo. With it, their fate was decided before they even opened their eyes. No kindergarten, no schooling, no career choices, just straight to the fields, the workshops, or wherever the owner wanted them. The impact on family life was devastating. For enslaved parents, the joy of a child's birth came tangled with dread. They knew the future was already stolen. Even if a father was free, or even if the father was the same man who owned the child, there was nothing he could do. The law didn't care about paternity. It only cared about the mother's status. Think of it like a car lease. You can swap drivers, repaint it, change the seats, but the name on the paperwork stays the same. In this analogy, the mother's status was the paperwork, and no matter what happened, ownership remained intact. Were there objections? Rarely, and they almost never succeeded. The system was too profitable, too entrenched. Lawmakers, judges, and wealthy landowners had too much to lose. When morality and money clash, history shows us which one usually wins. This legal foundation made organized breeding not only possible but financially tempting. Once you knew every child would be yours by law, it became easy to encourage reproduction. And if encourage sounds polite here, that's intentional, because in reality it was often coercive, and almost always against the will of the people involved. What's most chilling is how normal it became. By the 19th century, Advertisements openly sold entire families, with notes about the fertility of the women, marketed the way you'd describe a used car with good mileage. That's how far the humanity was stripped away. The law didn't just allow exploitation, it streamlined it. It made every enslaved woman a permanent investment and every birth a potential payday. And once you have a system like that in place, you can bet people will find ways to squeeze every ounce of profit from it. And that leads straight into the next part, the moment human lives started appearing as cold, precise numbers in a ledger. If the law was the green light, then the next step was making sure every asset was tracked, measured, and properly accounted for. This is where things get both deeply chilling and strangely bureaucratic. Because once you reduce a human being to property, it's only a short hop to treating them like a line item on a balance sheet. And plantation owners, they loved a good ledger. Picture a big leather-bound book with neat, looping handwriting, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique bookstore. Except instead of listing bushels of wheat or bales of cotton, the entries might read, Sarah, age 20, strong field hand, proven breeder or Tom, age 25, good with carpentry, fathered 3 healthy children. There it is. Someone's entire existence, their body, their relationships, their children, all distilled into bullet points for someone else's profit. If you've ever worked in an office and had to fill out a spreadsheet for human resources, imagine that. But without the human part. This wasn't HR. This was inventory management. Every person had a value, not just for the work they could do now, but for the future labor they might produce. Plantation owners didn't need LinkedIn recommendations. They needed wombs, muscle, and the ability to keep going under brutal conditions. And they logged it all, obsessively. The numbers were cold and impersonal. Women of childbearing age were often valued higher, not because of their skills, but because they could add to the workforce, no shipping costs required. Men who were physically strong, or who had fathered many children, were also noted as good stock. The language was borrowed directly from livestock management, and they didn't even try to hide it. Some records list breeding potential right alongside market prices for pigs and horses. That wasn't an accident. That was the mindset. One of the darker quirks here is how this bookkeeping created a sort of macabre regamification of human lives. Owners compared notes with each other, who had the most productive workers. Breeders produced the strongest children. It was bragging rights wrapped in cruelty. Imagine if your boss compared how many excellent employees your family produced, and then actually claimed ownership of your nieces and nephews. That's the level of absurdity we're talking about. And like any business with an eye on profit, there was a fixation on growth. The ledgers didn't just record names, they tracked numbers over time. Birth rates, survival rates, the ratio of working adults to children, all calculated to ensure maximum output. If a particular woman had a high number of surviving children, that got noticed. If she had fewer, it might spark questions about her efficiency, as though children were widgets coming off a factory line. Sometimes owners even made notes about temperament, as if this was some sort of customer service metric. Obedient, hardworking might as well have been a 5-star Yelp review in their eyes. And if someone was difficult, maybe because they tried to resist or refused to accept their situation, that got recorded too, often as a warning for the future. These details could influence whether a person was sold, kept, or paired with someone else for breeding purposes. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how normalized this became. We think of slavery as brutal physical labor, and it was, but it was also a paperwork machine. In some ways, the ledger was as much a tool of control as the whip. Because the moment your life is reduced to a number in a book, the person holding the pen decides your fate. And when those numbers get tied to profit margins, the human element disappears entirely. To make it more relatable, think about your credit score. That little number can decide whether you get a loan, rent an apartment, or even land a job. Now imagine that instead of your financial habits, the score came from your body, your children, and your family history, and you had no way to change it. That's how these ledgers worked. Once you were valued in a certain way, it followed you and your children forever. Some owners got downright creative with their record keeping. There are surviving documents where enslaved people are grouped by family units, not for sentimental reasons, but for tracking the output of each household. A mother with 3 teenage children who could work the fields was a jackpot. A man with a history of fathering strong, healthy workers was like a prize bull. And just like with livestock, they didn't see any ethical problem with reassigning people to new partners if they thought it might increase the numbers. What's especially unsettling is how this system blurred the lines between the personal and the financial. A birth, which for most people is a moment of joy, was in this context a bookkeeping event. Newborn, add 1 to the count. Toddler grows into a worker, update the valuation. Someone died. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a loss on the balance sheet. Cold, calculated, and without a hint of remorse. Of course, all this careful record-keeping wasn't just for day-to-day management. It also came in handy when it was time to sell people. Ledgers provided proof of value to potential buyers. A neat list showing a woman's age, number of children, and workability could mean a higher sale price. In that way, these books were both management tools and sales brochures. It's disturbing to realize that some of these records survive today, sitting in archives, a testament to how methodical the system was. The ledgers also reveal something else. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't random cruelty. It was planned, organized, and optimized, just like any other business. Plantation owners weren't stumbling through this. They were running it with the precision of a corporation, complete with performance tracking and asset growth strategies. It's one of the reasons the system lasted so long. It wasn't just sustained by violence, but by paperwork and profit logic. And here's the part that still twists the knife. Once you start thinking of people as data points, you stop thinking of them as people at all. You don't see a mother, you see a high-yield producer. You don't see a child, you see future labor. That shift in mindset, that ability to translate flesh and blood into ink and numbers, is what allowed slavery to become not just tolerated, but institutionalized. In the modern world, we still keep data on people. Fitness trackers, school test scores, employment files. But at least now in theory, those numbers are supposed to benefit the person they describe. Back then, the only one benefiting from the data was the person who owned the ledger. Everyone else was just on the page. And once those numbers were written down, they had a way of dictating the next steps. They told the owner who was worth investing in, who might be paired for better results, and who might be sold to balance the books. The ledger wasn't just a record of the system, it was the engine that kept it running. Which brings us to the next layer of this machinery. If you're going to treat human beings like livestock, you have to decide who gets selected to produce the next generation. And that, well, that's where the real cold calculus comes in. Imagine this. Survived another long day in the fields, your hands aching, your back one solid knot of pain. You think maybe, just maybe, you'll get a few hours of rest. Then you hear it, your name, called by someone who doesn't need to explain why. You already know. You've been selected. Now, if this were a modern job interview, you'd be preparing your resume, trying to make yourself look employable, maybe putting on your best shirt, the one without a mysterious stain. But in this world, you don't get to apply for the position. You are the position. And the job comes with no salary, no benefits, and no option to quit. The only perk is that someone else makes all the decisions for you, which is really less of a perk and more of a prison sentence with extra steps. The selection process was, on paper, very simple. Find the strongest, healthiest people, and pair them in a way that would produce the same traits in the next generation. In reality, it was every bit as calculated as a modern company assembling a dream team for maximum profit. Except here, the profit was human lives reduced to numbers in a ledger. Slavers had criteria, and they applied them with the cold detachment of someone picking fruit at the market. Strong arms? Check. Broad shoulders? Check. No signs of chronic illness? Check. And if you think they stopped there? Nope. They'd note whether someone could work from sunrise to sundown without collapsing, whether they had good teeth, which was basically the 19th century equivalent of a pre-employment health screening, whether they produced well, which is as dehumanizing as it sounds. It wasn't just about the physical traits. There was an unspoken calculation about temperament. Someone too rebellious, too outspoken, might not be worth the risk. Not because they couldn't have children, but because they might inspire those children to resist. On the other hand, someone docile, compliant, and resigned to their fate, that person was a good investment. Think about how chilling that is. Your personality being evaluated not for who you are, but for how profitable your children might be. The men selected for this system were often referred to as studs. Yes, the same word we still use for prized breeding animals. That wasn't an accident. It stripped away any sense of individuality or humanity, turning people into walking, working, reproducing assets. Women, of course, bore the heaviest weight. Their ability to conceive became not just a personal matter, but a matter of economic strategy. We sometimes imagine history as something that happens in broad strokes: wars, treaties, sweeping social changes. But here it was happening in small, private rooms, in quiet conversations between enslavers, planning matches like they were arranging furniture, and the people at the center of it had no say. No voice. No, I'd rather not. To be clear, this wasn't a one-off practice. Entire plantations operated like factories, with breeding as a scheduled, ongoing process. The enslavers would keep track of cycles, monitor outcomes, and adjust pairings if the results weren't meeting expectations. You can almost picture the plantation owner tapping a pencil against his ledger, like a modern manager reviewing quarterly sales numbers. Except instead of product sales, he's talking about human lives. Sometimes the selection meant separating people from the families they already had. You could be married, deeply attached to someone, and still be told you were now to be with someone else because it was better for the stock. If you resisted, there were punishments. If you complied, you lived with the grief of being torn from your loved ones, and the unspoken knowledge that your children were never really yours. It's tempting to think that the enslavers might have felt at least some discomfort with this level of control over human lives. And some did, in the way someone might feel a bit bad about kicking a dog out into the rain. But for most, the profit motive drowned out any shred of empathy. They weren't looking at mothers, fathers, brothers, or sisters. They were looking at investments, each one with a projected return that could be calculated down to the season. In the rare cases when the process didn't go as planned, maybe a child was born with an illness. Maybe a parent became unable to work. The response was as impersonal as returning defective merchandise. That person might be sold, sent to another plantation, or simply written off in the ledger as a loss. No tears, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the humanity involved. And yet, in the middle of all this cold calculation, there were cracks in the system. People found ways to hold on to their sense of self. They formed secret bonds, whispered names to newborns in the dark, told stories to their children that reminded them they were more than the sum of someone else's arithmetic. The selection process could decide where their bodies went, but not always where their hearts belonged. If you think about it, the most disturbing part isn't just the cruelty, it's how ordinary it became for the people running it. This wasn't some shadowy backroom scheme. It was discussed openly among slaveholders, written about in agricultural journals, and treated as just another part of good management. They talked about human reproduction the same way they talked about crop rotation or livestock feeding schedules. And maybe that's the part that hits hardest. Not the brutality itself, but the normalization of it. The idea that you could look another human being in the eye and see only their potential yield, and still go to bed at night thinking you were just doing your job. The selection process was the heart of the breeding system, the point where ideology and economics met flesh and blood. It wasn't about attraction, or love, or even survival in the way we understand it today. It was about control. Control over bodies, over futures, over the very possibility of choice. And once you understand that, the rest of the system starts to make an awful kind of sense. If you own someone's body, you can own their labor. If you own their labor, you can own their children. If you own their children, well, congratulations. You've just created a self-sustaining system of human exploitation, the kind that can last for generations without a single new purchase from the outside world. So the next time you hear someone describe slavery as just a part of history, remember this. It wasn't just whips and chains in the fields. It was spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed. It was recruitment without consent, a talent pipeline, where the talent didn't have a choice. And behind every cold calculation, there was a human life that had been weighed, measured, and decided upon without ever being asked. If the selection process felt like a grim parody of a job interview, then life after getting the job was, well, let's just say you wouldn't be posting about it on LinkedIn. Once someone was chosen, They weren't just joining the workforce. They were stepping into a role they had no way of quitting. With a lifetime contract that didn't require a signature, their worth wasn't measured in promotions or pay raises, but in how many more human beings they could bring into the same trap. For the women, the reality was especially heavy. Their daily lives carried two workloads, the visible one in the fields and the invisible one of simply existing as valuable property because of their ability to give birth. The calendar wasn't marked with birthdays or holidays. It was tracked by due dates and the time between them. Imagine being told your body was part of the farm equipment, like a plow or a cotton gin, except it didn't get stored in the barn at night. It walked, talked, and felt. But to the people in charge, it was still just an asset. Men in this system often found themselves reduced to something even more bluntly dehumanizing. Some were labeled as studs, not in the modern flirty sense, but in the literal livestock sense, expected to father as many children as possible, regardless of whether they wanted to or not. In some cases, this was with people they already knew and cared about, and in others, it was with complete strangers, chosen for them without their consent. There was no romantic subplot here, no music swells, no candlelight, just the cold math of more births equals more profit. And here's the part that's both heartbreaking and infuriating. Love and family still found a way to exist, but it was constantly under siege. Couples could be separated without warning. Parents could see their children sold away before they'd even learned to walk. And siblings might grow up on the same plantation yet rarely cross paths. The emotional bonds were real, but the system was designed to break them because broken bonds made people easier to control. It's like if every friendship you made came with a looming expiration date, except here, the end wasn't a move to another city. It was being sold like furniture. One woman, Mary, whose story survives in fragments from plantation records, was known to have given birth to 10 children. By the time she was 35, only one remained with her. The others had been sold or transferred elsewhere, scattered like seeds in the wind. Imagine living in a constant state of grieving while still being expected to pick cotton from sunup to sundown. That's the kind of quiet endurance that doesn't make it into most history textbooks. Because it's not dramatic enough, but it's the daily reality that breaks you in slow motion. For some, the loss of control over their own lives made time feel strange. Days blurred into each other. Years went by marked only by harvests and births. There was no 5-year plan, no dream of saving up for the future, because the future wasn't something you owned. And yet, in those rare stolen moments, maybe during a Sunday rest, or while tending a small patch of garden for their own food, people found slivers of humanity. They sang songs, told stories, and shared bits of wisdom with the next generation. It's not because it would change the system, but because it kept them human inside it. You might think, how could anyone survive that mentally? And the answer is, some didn't. Trauma was woven into daily life like threads in a rough cloth. But others developed an almost stubborn sense of self-preservation. If they couldn't choose their circumstances, they could at least choose their small acts of defiance, refusing to show joy when the owner wanted it, teaching their children secret words from their parents' language, or simply holding back their true thoughts like a private treasure no one could steal. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Because when we talk about slave breeding in the abstract, it sounds like some faceless economic strategy from the past. But zoom in, and you see individual people waking up every day under a system that tried to strip them of identity, yet still managing to hold on to it in ways that seem almost impossible now. From the outside, it might have looked like compliance. But under the surface, there was often quiet resistance brewing. Because as much as the system tried to turn people into cogs, the human spirit has this deeply annoying habit, at least for oppressors, of not staying fully under control. And that's simmering defiance. Well, that's exactly where our story is headed next. If life under the breeding system was a machine designed to break people down, then resistance was the stubborn grit in its gears. And no matter how well-oiled that machine seemed, grit always finds its way in. Some of it was loud and dramatic, the kind of thing that made headlines in abolitionist newspapers. But most of it was quiet, subtle, and meant to fly under the radar. Because here's the thing. Open rebellion was rare, not because people didn't want freedom, but because the odds were brutally stacked. It was like playing poker where the other guy holds all the cards, the chips, and the ability to arrest you for even thinking about betting. So resistance had to be creative. Sometimes that meant running, Escaping wasn't just about slipping away in the night. It was about navigating a labyrinth where every wrong turn could land you back at square one, or worse. There were people who made it hundreds of miles north, guided by whispered routes and secret safe houses. Others didn't make it more than a few miles before being dragged back, their bodies carrying the marks of the attempt. And yet they tried again. Imagine the kind of courage it takes to risk your life over and over, knowing the odds were basically lottery ticket in a hurricane level. Then there were the smaller acts, the ones that didn't make history books but still made a difference. Feigning illness, for example. Not the call in sick, because you binge-watched too much Netflix kind of sick, but the kind where you put on a convincing enough performance to avoid the fields for a day. A limp here, a cough there, maybe a little moaning for effect. It bought time. Time to rest, time to plan, or just time to breathe without someone barking orders at you. Sabotage was another favorite. And no, we're not talking about blowing things up in a Hollywood-style blaze. It could be something as simple as working slower than usual, breaking a tool by accident, or messing up a task just enough to make it unusable. The genius of this was that it could be passed off as clumsiness or bad luck, plausible deniability in action. Think of it as the 19th century version of accidentally hitting reply all to slow down the office chaos. For women trapped in the breeding system, resistance could take forms that were deeply personal. Some found ways to avoid pregnancies despite the enormous risks, if they were caught, whether through herbal knowledge passed quietly among them or simply refusing to comply in moments they could control. This was as much an act of rebellion as running away. It was a way of saying, "You will not own my future or my children's." And then there was the power of stories and songs. Enslaved people created music that sounded, to an outsider, like just another work chant. But layered inside those lyrics were coded messages, directions for escape, warnings about patrols, or even just encouragement to keep going. Imagine humming along to what you thought was a harmless tune, only to realize later it was basically a GPS for freedom. Of course, the most dangerous resistance of all was simply refusing to break, holding on to one's sense of self when everything around was designed to erase it. Family ties were maintained in stolen moments, names and histories were passed down in whispers, and traditions were kept alive despite the risk. It's hard to measure the courage it takes to keep loving in a place built on taking love away, but that's exactly what many did. And sometimes, resistance looked like humor. A joke told in hushed tones, a nickname for an overseer that only the enslaved community used, or a sarcastic comment muttered under one's breath. Humor doesn't topple systems by itself, but it can keep people human in the face of dehumanization. If you've ever survived a terrible job by making fun of it with your coworkers, you've got a tiny taste of what that might have felt like, just multiplied by about 1,000 in risk. These acts didn't end the system overnight, didn't make headlines in the halls of Congress, but they chipped away at the myth that enslaved people were passive. They accepted their fate. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, was a reminder that beneath the control and cruelty, there was still a heartbeat refusing to beat on command. And for the enslavers, the so-called masters, these acts were infuriating. They saw themselves as efficient managers of a labor force, but resistance was proof that their property thought, planned, and acted entirely outside their control. It was the hairline crack in the dam that no amount of patching could truly fix. Which brings us to their perspective, and the cold, unsettling way they justified everything. They say perspective is everything. From the outside, the slave breeding system looks exactly like what it was, a calculated exploitation of human lives. But from the master's point of view, they thought they were just running a business, like a 19th century startup. Except instead of selling shoes or coffee beans, their product was people. And no, they didn't think this was monstrous. They thought it was good management. To them, an enslaved woman wasn't just a person, she was a productive asset. Her children? Future labor units? The entire concept was stripped of humanity and wrapped up in the cozy language of economics. Diaries and letters from plantation owners often read like quarterly reports. One Virginia planter wrote in 1823 about increasing my stock naturally, as if he were bragging about a bumper crop of corn. Another in Georgia carefully tallied the output of women on his estate, noting which ones were most reliable. Reliable for what? Well, the implication is chilling. It's not that they were all cartoon villains twirling mustaches. Many saw themselves as respectable, God-fearing men upholding the economic lifeblood of their region. They told themselves this wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. In their world, without this system, plantations would fail, families would lose fortunes, and the southern way of life would crumble. That's the story they told themselves, so they could sleep at night. Some even dressed it up in faux paternalism. They'd claim they were taking care of their enslaved workers, providing shelter and sustenance. Of course, this conveniently ignored that the so-called shelter was often a shack. The sustenance was the bare minimum needed to keep a body working in the fields. But in their minds, that counted as generosity. It's like a boss saying, "We can't pay you, but we'll let you use the company coffee machine." The really unnerving part is how normal it all seemed to them. They were surrounded by neighbors doing the same thing, reading newspapers that never questioned the system, attending church sermons that politely avoided certain verses about loving thy neighbor. It was a social echo chamber, one where morality bent to match the economic reality. If everyone you know is playing the same game, it's a lot easier to pretend the rules are fair. And when laws like partis sequitur ventrum made the whole operation perfectly legal, it gave them that extra stamp of legitimacy. If it's in the law books, they figured, how could it possibly be wrong? That's the slippery magic of legality. It can turn something deeply immoral into something socially acceptable, with nothing more than a signature and a seal. Now, not every master spoke openly about breeding practices. It wasn't exactly polite dinner conversation, but among themselves, especially in business correspondence, it was plain as day. They'd swap tips on managing stock, just like ranchers discussing cattle. Some even arranged transactions where enslaved men were hired out specifically for their reproductive value, with fees set accordingly. The language was clinical, the tone utterly detached. The psychology here is fascinating in the most unsettling way. To see people purely as economic assets, you have to do a little mental gymnastics. You have to erase their humanity in your mind, reduce them to numbers, skills, and physical traits. It's the same trick that allows someone today to talk. It's about downsizing the workforce. Instead of firing people who have families to feed, it makes the reality easier to swallow. And that mental trick didn't just happen overnight. It was reinforced by every part of the system. The laws, the churches, the economic dependence, the social circles. Together, they formed a sort of moral insulation, a buffer between the plantation owner's conscience and the people whose lives he controlled. You could walk through your fields, see children playing outside the cabins, and still think of them not as kids, but as future field hands. Even the few who privately admitted the system was ugly often convinced themselves their personal approach was kinder than others. They'd say things like, "I don't split up families unless I must," as if that made the whole arrangement humane. That's the thing about human beings. We can justify almost anything, if it makes us feel like the good guy in our own story. The master's perspective wasn't just shaped by greed. It was also shaped by fear of economic ruin, fear of losing social standing, and, quietly, fear of what might happen if the people they controlled ever gained the freedom and the numbers to challenge the system. This fear was another reason breeding was encouraged. It increased the enslaved population while keeping it firmly under control. Think of it like a company that wants to expand production but refuses to give workers any voting shares. When you read the plantation records today, the coldness is almost surreal. A page might list names, ages, work assignments, and then a column for increase, meaning children born that year. That's it. No mention of the mother's names, no notes about the circumstances, just numbers in neat rows. It's as if the humanity was erased before the ink even dried. What's disturbing is that this mindset wasn't seen as monstrous in its time. It was seen as pragmatic, even responsible. That's the danger of living in a bubble where the abnormal becomes normal. It's why history is littered with examples of people doing awful things while convinced they were doing the right thing. And it's a good reminder for us now, because bubbles still exist. They just have Wi-Fi. The master's perspective might seem alien to us today, but the mental patterns, the justifications, the rebranding of cruelty as necessity, those haven't gone anywhere. You can find them in boardrooms, political speeches, and corporate memos, just with fancier fonts. And if history teaches us anything, it's that when we stop questioning the normal things around us, we risk becoming the modern version of someone else's cold calculus. It's tempting to think that this kind of cold-blooded human stock management was something uniquely American, like apple pie or drive-through coffee. But no, the idea of turning reproduction into a profit engine pops up in history like an unwelcome relative who keeps crashing on the couch. Different eras, different outfits, same core concept, people being reduced to assets, and the next generation viewed as tomorrow's dividends. Take the Caribbean during the height of the sugar boom. Those postcard-perfect beaches? Back then, they were less vacation getaway and more exhaustion factory. Plantations burned through human lives at a pace so brutal that importing new workers was a constant necessity. But once the transatlantic slave trade faced restrictions, local elites started to eye the same solution their American counterparts used. Why buy people from abroad when you can? Well, create them on site. Sugar, after all, didn't care where its labor came from, only that it kept flowing. The idea was as chillingly pragmatic as a factory manager deciding it's cheaper to make your own replacement parts than order them in. Even ancient Rome, that beacon of marble columns and toga-clad philosophers, had its own flavor of this. Romans liked to pretend they were above such base economics, but the truth was, states worked by enslaved labor often encouraged certain pairings to maintain or grow the workforce. You could be born under the Mediterranean sun, surrounded by olive groves and grapevines, and still find your life mapped out before you'd even learn to walk. Think of it as the world's worst long-term career plan. Born into the job, 0 promotions, and the benefits package, non-existent. Fast forward to the Ottoman Empire. They didn't exactly run plantations in the same sense, but they did operate systems of human control where lineage determined fate. In some cases, enslaved people were encouraged by economic incentive or outright coercion to have children who would be absorbed into the system. Here, the logic was more about sustaining a loyal servant class and feeding specific state or palace needs. Still, the underlying principle was depressingly familiar: the body as a unit of production and childbirth as a line item in the budget. The unsettling part is how universal this mindset becomes when you strip away the cultural costumes. Whether it's the American South's cotton fields, a Caribbean sugar plantation, a Roman villa, or the Ottoman court, the thinking runs in parallel. People aren't people, they're resources. The vocabulary might change. Sometimes it's breeding, sometimes it's continuity. Sometimes it's wrapped in religious or legal justification, but the end result is the same: lives planned by someone else's ledger. It's a little like seeing the same fast food chain in every country you visit. It's different menus, same logo, same business model. The menu in this case just happens to be human futures, and nobody's ordering voluntarily. And in each of these civilizations, there was always a convenient moral shield to justify it. Romans told themselves it was part of the natural order, that some were born to rule and others to serve. Caribbean planters hid behind the idea of economic necessity, as if sugar somehow held a gun to their heads. Ottoman elites could frame it as statecraft, maintaining stability through managed populations. The specifics change, but the mental gymnastics, timeless? If you zoom out, what's almost more disturbing is how normal it could feel to the people in power. A plantation ledger in Virginia, a Roman estate inventory, an Ottoman palace register. They're all written in the same dry, matter-of-fact tone. No emotional punctuation, no second-guessing, just asset acquired, asset productive, asset reproduced. That's it. The fact that those assets had names, fears, and dreams, not part of the calculation. And maybe that's the scariest takeaway from looking beyond America's borders. When a system is profitable enough, people everywhere can convince themselves it's acceptable. You don't need one specific culture or geography to get there, just the right mix of economic pressure, legal loopholes, and social blind spots. Then the cycle runs on autopilot. It also explains why this kind of exploitation doesn't feel like an American problem, or a Roman problem, or an Ottoman problem. It's a human problem. Give almost any society enough incentive, and history shows there's a decent chance someone will find a way to turn the cradle into a cog in the machine. Which is both depressing and a reminder to keep an eye on our own time, just in case we're dressing up the same old idea in shinier packaging. Because if the past is any indication, all it takes is a few rational-sounding excuses, some polite paperwork, and boom, You've got another system where human life gets quietly filed under production capacity, and it'll probably be recorded in the same tidy handwriting too. The system didn't end with a single dramatic slam of a gavel. It wasn't some grand moment where everyone shook hands, apologized, and agreed to never do it again. Instead, it fell apart the way an old rotten fence does, a post here, a board there, till one day it just can't stand up anymore. The first big crack came from the American Civil War. When you have an entire war partly over whether human beings can be owned, you can bet the economy built on breeding them is going to take a hit. And hit it did hard. Plantations that once ran like cruel, well-oiled machines were suddenly losing the very property their profits depended on. Imagine a modern tech company suddenly being told all their servers have to walk out the door, except those servers are people, and they have absolutely no interest in coming back. Then came the legal death blow, the 13th Amendment in 1865, abolishing slavery on paper. Of course, like any loophole-loving system, exploitation didn't vanish. It just changed its clothes. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The point is, the law officially pulled the rug out from under the whole breeding operation. Overnight, human beings went from assets to free labor force that refuses to work for free, and for enslavers, that was an economic nightmare. But here's the thing, ending the system didn't end the damage. You don't just wipe away generations of forced births, broken families, and commodified humanity with a single sentence in the Constitution. Families that had been torn apart by sales or strategic breeding often couldn't find each other again. Some searched for decades, placing ads in newspapers that read like missing person posters. Seeking my mother. Sold from Richmond in 1848. Imagine not knowing if your brother was alive, or if the child you last saw at age 3 would even recognize you. And socially, that scar ran deep. Many formerly enslaved people had to navigate a world where the same neighbors who once claimed to own them were now expected to treat them as equals. Which, spoiler alert, most didn't. Prejudice didn't evaporate with emancipation. It just became less about legal ownership and more about inventing new ways to keep people in their place. Economically, the South scrambled to reinvent itself. Without the breeding system to supply new generations of unpaid workers, labor had to be sourced in other, more creative ways. This is where you start to see things like sharecropping and convict leasing, systems that, in their own twisted way, kept the same power imbalance alive. It's like outlawing one scam only for someone to open the exact same business under a slightly different name. And the mindset, well, it lingered. You can dismantle the structure, but the attitudes that built it don't just vanish overnight. The cold arithmetic of profit per human body left behind a legacy of dehumanization that seeped into every corner of society. It's one thing to remove the chains. It's another to convince people to stop seeing other people as commodities. By the late 19th century, the literal breeding farms were gone, but the ghosts of the system walked right alongside the living. They were there in the way black families were denied land, in the laws that tried to control where they could live or work, in the scientific racism that dressed old prejudices in a lab coat. The breeding system might have collapsed, but its shadow stretched far into the so-called new era of freedom. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The end wasn't really an end, it was a pivot. The exploitation just found new packaging. You'd think a system as brutal as forced breeding would be buried with the past, right? It's like some shameful old VHS tape hidden at the back of the closet. But here's the depressing plot twist. The movie just got a new cover. The cast changed. The costumes are different, but the storyline? Practically identical. Today, no one is running open-air markets with people in chains, at least not where the cameras can see. But human trafficking? Oh, it's thriving. And it's not just a somewhere far-away problem. Right now, there are people in your own country working against their will. On farms, in factories, in kitchens, because someone decided they were more profitable when controlled. In the 1800s, enslaved women's bodies were seen as investment capital. In 2025, someone might see a trafficked worker the same way, an asset that doesn't clock out and doesn't demand benefits. And then there's forced marriage, another uncomfortable relative of the old system. Back then, the breeding wasn't exactly about love and romance, understatement of the century. Today, millions, yes, millions, are pushed into marriages they didn't choose, often for economic or social reasons. Different context, same loss of agency, It's like the breeding system traded in its plantation for a wedding hall. Here's where it gets even more stomach-churning. Supply chains. Ever bought chocolate, seafood, or cheap clothes? Congratulations, you might have indirectly supported forced labor without even knowing it. You've basically globalized the plantation model, except now the fields might be on the other side of the world, tucked safely out of sight. In the past, plantation owners kept ledgers of their breeders. Today, corporations track productivity with software. The tools are shinier, but the dehumanization is déjà vu. Even the language has evolved to stay under the radar. No one says slave anymore. They say undocumented worker, debt-bonded laborer, domestic servant. Sounds gentler, doesn't it? Just like in the 19th century, when enslavers described breeding as encouraging natural increase. Same PR tricks, new marketing team. The scariest part, just like in the past, there's money at the root of it all. Trafficking today is worth billions, more than some countries' GDP, and as long as it's profitable, people will find ways to justify it. That's exactly how the breeding system survived for so long. As long as someone was cashing in, morality took a back seat. But here's the tiny shred of hope. More people are aware now. Anti-slavery groups, investigative journalists, even everyday shoppers are asking uncomfortable questions about where their stuff comes from. In the old system, resistance meant running for your life. Today it might mean boycotting a brand, blowing the whistle, or pressuring lawmakers. Different battlefield, same fight. So when we talk about the echoes of slave breeding, it's not just a poetic metaphor. Those echoes are actual people, living right now in situations that rhyme with history a little too closely. The system didn't die, it morphed. The only way to kill it for good is to stop pretending it's ancient history. If you've ever been in a meeting where someone says, "Let's look at the numbers," you know the air gets a little heavier. It's about to happen here, except these aren't sales figures or monthly reports. These numbers carry the weight of lives lived, stolen, and passed down like property. And the truly gut-punch part. For a lot of enslavers, that's exactly how they saw them, as property totals, not people. Historians estimate that between the late 1700s and the mid-1800s, hundreds of thousands of people were born into slavery in the United States alone, not imported from Africa, but born on American soil because the law made it profitable. The exact number? We'll never know precisely, because enslaved births weren't recorded like human events. They were logged like inventory. One plantation ledger might read, increase, 3 this year, as if they were talking about sheep or pigs. You could almost hear the sound of a cash register ringing in the background. To put it in perspective, think about the population of a modern city. Richmond, Virginia today has about 225,000 people. Imagine every single person in that city having their life's first chapter written not by their parents, but by a line in a slaveholder's account book. And then, multiply that across multiple Richmonds over decades. We're not talking about a trickle, we're talking about a generational conveyor belt. One historian, Michael Tadman, estimated that by the 1850s, up to 1/3 of all enslaved people in the American South had been born as part of this forced increase. That's like saying every third person in a crowded mall was there because someone empowered decided their birth would be financially convenient. You walk down the food court and count. 1, 2, forced birth. 1, 2, forced birth. Try doing that for a few minutes without feeling slightly sick. And these numbers weren't abstract for the people who owned them. They were dollar signs. In 1860, a strong young man in his 20s could sell for the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today. A woman in her prime childbearing years, her value was not only her own labor, but the potential bonus of any children she might have. It's the kind of cold calculation that makes modern corporate cost-cutting look warm and fuzzy by comparison. Here's the other thing about statistics. They flatten. They turn chaos, grief, and resistance into something that can be plotted on a neat little chart. But behind every unit of increase was someone who had a name, a voice, a laugh, maybe a crooked smile they got from their dad. They had the capacity to dream about their future, and that future was stolen before they even knew it existed. A chart doesn't tell you that. A spreadsheet won't show you the way someone's hands shook when they realized their child's fate was already sealed by law. If you wanted to get really dramatic, and let's be honest, sometimes history deserves a bit of drama. You could imagine all those numbers not as ink on paper, but as faces in a crowd, staring back at you in silence. The crowd just keeps getting bigger the longer you look. This is where the weight of history sneaks in. Because even though we can't pin down the exact figures, we know they're big enough to have shaped entire communities, cultures, and family lines. That's why historians keep chasing the numbers, not because they want to reduce people to math, but because the math reveals the scale of what happened, and you realize how vast it was. The story stops being a niche historical detail and starts being something that changed the course of the nation. And here's the thing about scale. It makes the echoes louder. Those hundreds of thousands of births weren't just individual tragedies. They were the building blocks of an entire economic and social system. The wealth generated by those statistics didn't vanish when slavery ended. It's still woven into certain institutions, land ownership, and even generational wealth patterns today. Numbers have long shadows, and these stretch further than most people want to admit. So yeah, numbers can be boring. But in this case, they're the most chilling part of the story. Because every time you see +1 in a slave ledger, it wasn't just a record of birth, it was a record of captivity, one that would ripple forward for generations. Memories? A funny thing. Some stories are told so often they become family folklore, like that one uncle who swears he invented the internet. Other stories? They disappear into the quiet, sealed up like old letters no one dares open. For many descendants of enslaved people, the history of breeding farms and forced family separation sits firmly in that second category. Not because it's forgotten, but because speaking it aloud feels like touching a bruise that never healed. You might expect that such a massive, horrific system would leave behind endless public records, commemorations, maybe even museums on every corner. Instead, it's often a patchwork of whispers, diary scraps, and half-remembered names. Families piecing together their past find themselves doing the historical equivalent of detective work, with the lights off, digging through census records, church archives, and oral histories passed down like fragile glass. Sometimes all that's left is a name on a faded gravestone, if even that. And here's the thing. Silence doesn't mean absence. In many communities, people knew the stories. They just didn't tell them outside the family. Imagine growing up hearing your grandmother's cryptic remark that our people came from hard soil, and only realizing in adulthood what she meant. The pain was so deeply woven into daily life that naming it felt dangerous, or pointless, or both. That silence had a side effect. For generations, much of the wider public could pretend it never happened. After all, if the survivors didn't speak, then maybe there was nothing to hear, right? That's the sort of thinking that let history textbooks skip entire chapters, reducing centuries of human suffering to a polite footnote sandwiched between cotton boom and civil war. It's like summarizing Titanic as a story about ocean travel. Technically true, completely dishonest. Of course, not every descendant kept quiet. Some became the storytellers, the keepers of names and dates and places. Their work is what allows us to even have this conversation. Oral historians in the African American community carried family trees in their heads, linking cousins separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time. They remembered who was sold where, who came back, and who vanished entirely. These weren't just facts, they were acts of resistance. This is where intergenerational trauma steps into the picture. And no, it's not just an academic buzzword. It's the reality of how pain gets passed along, even when the original events are long over. Maybe it's a mistrust of authority that seems irrational to outsiders, but is rooted in centuries when authority meant danger. Maybe it's family bonds that are unusually fierce, because once upon a time, family could be stolen overnight. Trauma doesn't evaporate just because the law changes. It adapts, lingers, and shows up in ways people can't always explain. Other countries wrestle with their own versions of this. Germany has a complex and public relationship with its World War II history. South Africa has the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Apartheid. But in the US, the conversation around slavery, especially the more hidden parts like breeding farms, has often been more like pulling teeth. Painful, slow, and full of people insisting, do we really need to talk about this? Spoiler, yes. And here's the awkward part. Silence is never neutral. It protects someone. In this case, it's not the descendants of the enslaved who benefit from the forgetting. It's the descendants of the people who profited, and the systems that still echo those old hierarchies. Telling the story isn't just about remembering the past. It's about refusing to let that silence keep doing its job. So when a descendant today speaks up about what happened to their ancestors, they're not just recounting history, they're breaking a generational rule. They're picking up that sealed envelope and saying, we're opening this now. And maybe that's the first step toward making sure no one can pretend it was just a footnote ever again. It's easy to look back at a system like this and think, well, that was just the past. People were different then. But that's the dangerous part. People weren't that different. They laughed at bad jokes, worried about their kids, complained about the weather. They just happened to live inside a moral framework that told them this was fine. And that's the real cautionary tale. Once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. That's how entire societies can walk past suffering without even turning their heads. History like this matters because it forces us to see the invisible walls in our own time. The things we accept because they're wrapped in polite language, legal paperwork, or clever PR. The breeding farms didn't advertise themselves as places of cruelty. They framed it as self-sustaining labor. Sounds almost admirable, until you remember what that actually meant. That's why remembering this isn't just about guilt or shame. It's about keeping our radar sharp for the next time someone tries to package exploitation as progress. And let's be honest, humans are great at rebranding bad ideas. We've gone from slavery to sharecropping, from child labor to internships with no pay. The costumes change, but the plot stays suspiciously similar. Learning about this past means you're better equipped to spot when history tries to sneak back in wearing new clothes. Because at the core, this isn't a story about the past, it's a mirror. It shows what happens when profit takes priority over people, when entire human lives are reduced to numbers in someone else's ledger. That mindset doesn't retire, it just relocates. And if we don't talk about where it's been, we can't see where it might be headed. Somewhere, out in the countryside, the cotton fields are quiet now. The wind moves through them like it's searching for something, maybe a voice, maybe a memory. There's no shouting overseer, no clank of tools, no hurried footsteps. Yes, the sound of the plants swaying like a slow wave. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the lives that pass through here, the laughter stolen in secret moments, the whispered plans for freedom, the lullabies sung softly so no one else could hear. The earth doesn't forget. It holds everything, the weight of footsteps, the warmth of bodies, the stories too heavy to speak out loud. And in that quiet, you realize history isn't locked away in books or museums. It's under your feet, in the air, in the way certain truths make you pause. You can choose to walk past it, or you can stop and listen, because those echoes, they don't fade, they wait. And maybe, just maybe, the reason they wait is for someone to finally understand.